Hey there, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to look at 1861 to 1865, which is roughly the complete story of the American Civil War. So let's get into it. We usually don't do time periods this long, but this is actually one of our most requested videos. Or really, when you consider that this is one of the most significant conflicts in world history, I think it deserves a little bit of extra time. So first off, what caused this war? Well, the big one is slavery. While the U.S. was built on the idea of human equality, the reality was that many states participated in the buying and selling of human beings as property, and this contradiction would cause increasing tension throughout the 1800s. Another major factor was states' rights. The southern states felt that they had the right to govern themselves independently of federal laws, especially when it came to slavery. And then finally, we have something called sectional tensions. Basically, the North and the South had grown increasingly different from each other over time, and this culminated in the formation of two separate political parties in the 1850s, the Republican Party of the North and the Democratic Party of the South. This split would only grow wider until eventually it broke into a full-blown crisis. In February of 1860, a group of Southern Democrats met in secession. They stated that since the federal government could not protect their way of life, they were leaving the Union and forming their own country. By March, 6 states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces attacked an American fort called Fort Sumter, located in the state of South Carolina. This was the first battle of the Civil War, and the Confederates won. It was also kind of a relief because up until this point, many people hoped that the conflict could be resolved peacefully. Now that wasn't going to happen. The president at this time was Abraham Lincoln, called for volunteers to put down this rebellion and preserve the Union. After hearing about Fort Sumter, 4 additional slave states decided to leave the Union and join the Confederacy. The border states of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky remained in the Union despite the fact that many people from those states supported the Confederacy. In fact, the capital of the Confederacy was located in Richmond, Virginia, which was in a border state. Now, before we go any further, I should probably explain the two sides of this war. On one side, we have the Union, also known as the United States of America. They were led by President Abraham Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant. Their goal was to preserve the Union and defeat the Confederacy. And then on the other side, we have the Confederacy, also known as the Confederate States of America. They were led by President Jefferson Davis, and at various points by Generals Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, J. Ab Stewart, and James Longstreet. Their goal was to win independence and form their own nation. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, let's get to some important battles. The first major battle of the war was the First Battle of Bull Run, or the First Battle of Manassas. This took place in July of 1861 near Manassas, Virginia. The Confederates won this battle, which proved that the war would not be over quickly. The Union Army under General George B. McClellan spent a year training and drilling. In the meantime, the Confederacy under General P.G.T. Beauregard attacked Fort Donelson in Tennessee, but it fell to American forces under General Grant. After this victory, General Grant was given command of all U.S. forces. In September of 1862, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson scored a brilliant victory over Union forces at the Battle of Kernstown, Virginia. But just a few days later, Union General George B. McClellan finally got his chance to shine. He led the Union Army to a victory at the Battle of Antietam, which was also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg. This was the single bloodiest day in American history with nearly 23,000 casualties. And after the battle, both sides claimed victory. But if you want the truth, the real winner was the Union. Not only did they win, but they also forced the Confederates to retreat. This meant that the Union now controlled the important supply depot at Harper's Ferry. In November of 1862, Lincoln announced that the Union would now fight to end slavery. At the same time, he sent General Burnside to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. Instead, he ended up getting trapped there and losing thousands of men. In 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee invaded the North. His goal was to get a victory that would force Lincoln out of office. On July 1st, the two armies met at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The fighting was extremely intense. Major General John Reynolds, who commanded the Union forces on the first day, was killed in action. On the second day, Confederate troops pushed the Union forces back through the town of Gettysburg and almost captured them. But on the third day, the Union held their ground, and the Confederates lost thousands of men. This battle was a turning point in the war. Not only was it a tactical victory for the Union, but it also crushed Confederate hopes for foreign aid. France and Britain had been considering entering the war on the side of the Confederacy, but after hearing about the heroic stand at Gettysburg, both countries decided against it. After the battle, General Grant moved his troops to the Mississippi River and began to squeeze the Confederacy. He cut off supplies to the western part of the Confederacy by capturing the city of Memphis, Tennessee, and then moving south to capture the vital supply base at Vicksburg, Mississippi. When these cities fell, the Mississippi was officially in Union hands, and this meant that the Confederacy could no longer use the river to transport goods. Also, this opened up the Mississippi to trade, which provided the Union with additional funds. In the meantime, Confederate General William T. Sherman was pushing north from Atlanta, Georgia. He wanted to capture the city of Knoxville, Tennessee, but he was defeated by Union General Burnside. Sherman then turned around and marched to the sea. He basically destroyed everything in sight, and by the time he was finished, Atlanta was in ruins. Following this, Sherman's troops continued their march through South Carolina, destroying anything that might help the Confederacy win the war. By 1865, it was clear that the Confederacy could not win the war. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The official surrender of the Confederate Army took place 5 days later. Okay, now let's look at some important figures. On the Union side, we have President Abraham Lincoln. He was famous for his commitment to preserving the Union and ending slavery. We also have General Ulysses S. Grant. He was famous for his perseverance and for winning important victories. And then finally, we have General William T. Sherman. He was famous for his march through Georgia and South Carolina. On the Confederate side, we have President Jefferson Davis. He was famous for trying to build a new government based on states' rights. We also have General Robert E. Lee. He was famous for his military brilliance, even though he ultimately lost the war. Then we have General Stonewall Jackson. He was famous for his victory at Chancellorsville, but he was killed by his own troops at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And finally, we have General James Longstreet. He was famous for his skill as a tactician, but he often disagreed with General Robert E. Lee. In terms of technology and tactics, this was the first modern war. The weapons were more advanced and the fighting was much more brutal. There were around 620,000 total casualties, the majority of those being Confederate soldiers. About half of the deaths were caused by disease, and the other half were caused by combat. For example, smallpox was a huge problem in the early years of the conflict. The treatment of disease and injuries also played a role in the high casualty rate. Many soldiers died from infections because of unsanitary conditions. Medical science was simply not advanced enough to deal with the number of casualties on both sides. New weapons also contributed to the high death toll. For example, the rifled musket was a new weapon that was used during this war. It allowed soldiers to shoot more accurately from longer distances. This meant that the old style of fighting close-range battles no longer worked. Anyway, let's take a look at some important conclusions. Slavery was officially abolished after the passage of the 13th Amendment. This was a huge step forward for human rights. However, the promise of equality was not fulfilled immediately. In fact, the Southern states resisted integration for decades. This eventually led to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The war also led to the beginning of the modern American state. The federal government became much stronger and the states' rights were significantly weakened. Finally, the legacy of the Civil War continues to be felt today. We remember the fallen with a moment of silence every November. And we continue to debate the meaning of the war and its causes. And that's all I've got. If you like this video, please hit that thumbs up button. If you love this video, please subscribe. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.